year 1897, decades after the Civil War had carved its scars across the American South, a team of laborers arrived at the edge of a forgotten Alabama plantation to tear down what remained of a decaying chapel. The structure stood alone amid dead fields and sunken graves, its walls blackened by time and neglect, its windows empty as the sockets of a skull. The land around it had long since been abandoned, the soil exhausted, the trees skeletal and reaching toward an indifferent sky. No one had worshipped there in nearly half a century. No one had dared. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please subscribe and like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The workers moved through their task with the mechanical efficiency of men who had demolished 100 such ruins before. But when they reached the baptismal font, a massive stone basin cracked down its center like a broken heart. Something made them pause. The font would not budge. They pried at it with crowbars, cursed it, struck it with hammers until finally the basin shifted and revealed beneath it a hollow recess carved into the foundation itself. Inside that darkness, wrapped in linen gone brittle as bone, lay a collection of pages covered in a cramped, frantic hand. The laborers, unlettered men for the most part, could make little sense of the words, but the foreman, who had learned his letters from a country schoolmarm, read the first line aloud to the gathered men. His voice faltered as he spoke. "I have drowned them all, and still my soul remains unclean." The confession bore a date, December the 14th, 1849. It was signed in a trembling script, Eleanor Whitmore, wife of Reverend Josiah Whitmore, servant of God, daughter of damnation. The discovery sent ripples through the academic community of the Deep South. The document made its way to the desk of Dr. Mary Ann Holt, a historian at the University of Alabama who had spent her career excavating the buried horrors of the antebellum period. She had read countless testimonies of cruelty, had traced the economics of human bondage through ledgers stained with blood and sweat. But this confession was different. This was not the calculated brutality of an overseer or the casual violence of a master. This was something else entirely. Dr. Holt traveled to the site on a cold morning in late autumn. The chapel ruins stood exactly as described in the workers' reports, surrounded by swampland that encroached upon the clearing like a living thing. The air smelled of rot and stagnant water. When she approached the baptismal font, still lying on its side where the workers had left it, she understood why they had fled. Embedded in the base of the stone basin, set into the rock like offerings to some pagan deity, were human teeth, 7 of them. Small and yellowed with age, but unmistakably real. The workers had prized them loose and left them scattered in the dirt, too frightened to touch them further. Dr. Holt knelt in the mud and lifted one tooth to the pale light. It was a molar, its roots still intact. She placed it carefully in a glass vial and sealed it. Then she retrieved the confession from her leather satchel and read it again, there in the shadow of the ruined chapel, with the swamp breathing its fetid breath across her neck. Eleanor Whitmore had been 23 years old when she married the Reverend Josiah Whitmore in the spring of 1842. The marriage records described her as the daughter of Thomas and Catherine Ashford, plantation owners whose wealth had been built upon the cultivation of cotton and the exploitation of over 200 enslaved souls. The Ashfords were not unusual in this regard. What set them apart, what marked them in the whispered histories of Montgomery County, was the particular cruelty with which they exercised their dominion. Thomas Ashford had earned a reputation as a breeder, a man who treated his human property as livestock to be improved through selective coupling. His ledgers, which Dr. Holt obtained from the county archives, made no distinction between the breeding of horses and the breeding of men. He recorded bloodlines, noted physical characteristics, documented births and deaths with the same clinical detachment he might apply to his crop yields. Eleanor grew up in this world. She learned her letters from a tutor who was himself the son of an enslaved woman and the plantation overseer. She took her meals served by hands that bore the scars of her father's whip. She learned to pray from a mother who believed that slavery was God's design, that the curse of Ham justified every indignity, every separation of families, every body sold down the river. But Eleanor was different, or so the early entries in her diary suggested. She wrote of nightmares, of dreams in which the faces of the enslaved rose from the cotton fields like specters, their eyes accusing, their mouths forming words she could not hear. She wrote of waking in the night with the sensation of drowning, of water filling her lungs even as she gasped in the dry air of her bedroom. She married the Reverend Josiah Whitmore, perhaps to escape, or perhaps to find meaning in the guilt that consumed her. Josiah was 20 years her senior, a man of moderate education and immoderate piety. He had come to Montgomery County to minister to the white families of the region, to offer spiritual comfort to those whose wealth was founded upon the suffering of others. He preached a gospel of order and obedience, of masters and servants, of a divine hierarchy that placed the white man just below the angels. Eleanor became his helpmate, his assistant in the work of salvation, and it was in this role that she first requested permission to baptize the enslaved. The plantation ledgers from 1844 record the first baptism performed by Eleanor Whitmore. The subject was a man named Isaiah, age 32, described in the ledger as strong of back, sound of mind, suitable for field work. Isaiah had been purchased by the Ashford plantation just 3 months prior, separated from his wife and children in the sale. The baptism took place not in the chapel, but at the edge of the swamp, where a tributary of the Alabama River pooled in a natural basin. Eleanor insisted that baptism must be performed in living water, not in the dead stone of the font. The Reverend Josiah, already weakened by the fevers that would eventually claim his sight, agreed. There were no witnesses to what transpired between Eleanor Whitmore and the man called Isaiah at the water's edge that evening. But 7 days later, Isaiah was found drowned in the same pool where he had been baptized. The plantation records note his death with a single line: Isaiah drowned December 7, 1844. In her ledger, kept separate from the plantation records, Eleanor wrote a single word beside his name: freed. Over the next 5 years, Eleanor Whitmore baptized 23 enslaved men. Every single one of them died within a fortnight of their baptism. Some drowned. Others succumbed to sudden illness. One fell from a barn roof, his neck broken. Another was trampled by horses. The causes varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Dr. Holt spread the documents across the desk in her university office and traced the progression with growing horror. She had obtained Eleanor's private ledger, discovered hidden with the confession, and the correlations were undeniable. Each baptism was recorded with the man's name, the date, and a brief notation. After each death, Eleanor wrote the same word: freed. But there was more. Between the official records and Eleanor's notations, Dr. Holt found something else: letters. Dozens of them, written by Eleanor to her husband's parish and to various ministers throughout Alabama. The letters spoke of her spiritual mission, of her desire to cleanse the sins of the flesh through the waters of rebirth. The language was evangelical, fervent, but beneath the religious rhetoric, Dr. Holt detected something else: an obsession, a fixation that went beyond the bounds of Christian charity. In one letter, dated April of 1846, Eleanor wrote, "The Negro soul is burdened with the sins of their condition, with the carnal knowledge forced upon them by those who claim mastery over their bodies. How can they enter the kingdom of heaven with such stains upon them? I have been called to wash them clean, to take their sins into myself, that they might be pure before the Lord. Dr. Holt read the letter 3 times before the full implication settled upon her. Eleanor was not simply baptizing these men, she was claiming to absolve them through some form of spiritual transference, through taking their sins into her own body. But how? The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the papers preserved in the county archives, Dr. Holt found a letter written by a man named Samuel, one of the enslaved on the Ashford plantation. The letter was addressed to a minister in Mobile, a known abolitionist who had been smuggling correspondence from enslaved people to northern newspapers. Samuel's letter never reached its destination. It had been intercepted by the plantation overseer and filed away with other confiscated materials. Dr. Holt sat alone in the archive's reading room as daylight faded beyond the windows. She read Samuel's letter by lamplight, and the words seemed to crawl across the page like living things. Reverend Sir, I write to you in desperation. The Reverend's wife has called me to baptism, as she has called others before me. I have seen what becomes of those who accept her invitation. Marcus drowned. Joseph took fever. Abraham fell and broke his skull, all within days of their baptism. I know what they will not say. I know what she does in the water. She says the Lord forgives us if we give her our breath in the water. She says the sins of the flesh can only be washed away through the flesh itself. She takes us into the water at dusk when no one can see. She puts her hands upon us and speaks prayers that turn to whispers. She says we must give ourselves to God through her, that she is the vessel of our salvation. I felt her lips on mine before the light went out. Not the holy kiss of Christian fellowship, Reverend, but something else. Something that made my body betray me even as my soul cried out in horror. I saw the devil behind her eyes, Reverend. I saw him plain as day. I have refused the baptism. I told her I am not ready, that I must prepare my soul. But she insists. The Master insists. They say it is for my own good, for the good of my immortal soul. But I know the truth. Every man she baptizes is buried before the season turns. If you receive this letter, pray for me. And if I do not write again, know that I died with the taste of her sin upon my lips. The letter was dated June the 9th, 1847. According to the plantation ledger, Samuel died on June the 16th of that same year. The cause of death was listed as drowning. Dr. Holt set the letter down with trembling hands. The reading room had grown dark around her, and she realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, but the air felt thick and foul, as if the words on the page had contaminated the atmosphere itself. She returned to Eleanor's confession with new understanding, reading now for what lay beneath the religious language, for the true nature of what had transpired in those dark waters. Eleanor Whitmore believed she was cursed. This much was clear from the opening pages of her confession. She believed that the sins of her father and his father before him, the accumulated cruelty of generations of slave traders and slave owners, had been visited upon her soul. She described nightmares in which she stood before the throne of God and was found wanting, in which the blood of the enslaved cried out from the ground and demanded judgment. I am my father's daughter, she wrote. I am born of his sin, marked with his guilt. My soul is stained with the suffering he inflicted, with the families he destroyed, with the lives he treated as commodities to be bought and sold. I cannot escape this inheritance. I cannot wash it away with prayer alone. The mark is too deep, the stain too dark. She claimed to have received a vision on the night of her 25th birthday. In this vision, she stood at the edge of the swamp and saw the water turn to blood. From the crimson pool rose the spirits of the enslaved, their bodies bearing the marks of violence, their faces twisted in anguish. They surrounded her, pressed close, and she felt their suffering as her own. Their pain became her pain. Their despair became her despair. And then, she wrote, a voice spoke to her. Not the voice of God, she insisted, but the voice of divine justice itself. The voice told her that her soul could be cleansed, but only through sacrifice. Only through the willing acceptance of sin into her own body could she achieve redemption. She must become the vessel that absorbed the corruption, that drew the poison from the world. She must take their sins into herself, through the most intimate of unions. The baptisms, Eleanor explained in her confession, were not merely symbolic. They were transfigurative. She believed that through the union of flesh in the water, through the mingling of breath and body, she could absorb the sins that had been inflicted upon these men. The sexual violation they had endured, the brutality they had witnessed, the dehumanization they had suffered, all of this could be transferred to her through an act of intimacy that was simultaneously sacred and profane. I took them into the water at twilight, she wrote, when the boundary between day and night grows thin, when the veil between the mortal and the divine is at its most permeable. I spoke the words of baptism as the Reverend had taught me, but I added my own prayers, my own invocations. I called upon the Spirit of redemption to use my body as its instrument. I kissed them as Judas kissed Christ, as a mark of both betrayal and devotion. I felt their fear, their confusion, their helpless arousal. I felt their bodies respond even as their spirits recoiled. And in that moment of terrible intimacy, I drew their sin into myself. I felt it enter me like poison burning through my veins, settling in my bones. I became polluted so that they might be pure. And then I held them beneath the water until the light left their eyes. Dr. Holt closed the confession and stood abruptly from her desk. She walked to the window and stared out at the darkening campus, at the students hurrying between buildings in the gathering dusk. The normalcy of the scene felt obscene, a mockery of the horror she had been reading. Eleanor Whitmore had not merely seduced these men. She had violated them, used their bodies as instruments of her own twisted theology, and then she had murdered them, convinced that their deaths completed the ritual of transference, that by drowning them, she was drowning her own sins. The psychological complexity of her delusion was staggering. She had constructed an entire cosmology of guilt and redemption that allowed her to perpetrate atrocity while believing herself to be an agent of salvation. She had taken the language of Christianity, the imagery of baptism and rebirth, and perverted it into something monstrous. And the most disturbing aspect of all was that she genuinely believed she was saving them. In her warped understanding, she was offering them the only path to heaven that existed for enslaved people, a path that required their complete submission, their violation, and ultimately their death. Dr. Holt returned to her desk and opened the confession once more. There were still pages left to read, and she knew that the worst revelations were yet to come. Eleanor's rituals escalated over time. The confession detailed how she began to crave the baptisms, to feel an almost physical hunger for the moment of transference. She described the sensation of absorbing sin as both agonizing and ecstatic, a pain that bordered on pleasure, a violation that felt like fulfillment. "I know this marks me as depraved," she wrote. "I know that what I feel in those moments is not holy, cannot be holy, but I am helpless against it. When I take their sin into myself, when I feel their life force entering my body through breath and kiss, when I hold them beneath the water and feel them struggle, and then still, in those moments, I am transformed. I am no longer Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of Thomas Ashford, bearer of generational guilt. I become something else, something pure and terrible and necessary." She began to seek out specific men for baptism, those who had been separated from their families, those who bore scars from whippings, those whose eyes held a particular kind of despair. She told herself she was choosing those most in need of salvation, but the confession reveals a darker truth. She was drawn to suffering, to trauma, to pain. She fed upon it. The Reverend Josiah Whitmore, by this time nearly blind from progressive illness, suspected nothing. He praised his wife's devotion, her commitment to the spiritual welfare of the enslaved. He wrote letters to other ministers extolling her work, describing her as an angel of mercy, a woman who had dedicated herself to the salvation of the African race. The enslaved community on the Ashford plantation, however, knew the truth. They could not speak it openly, could not voice their horror to the white authorities, who would not believe them and might punish them for the accusation. But they knew. They called Eleanor the River Witch when they thought no one could hear. They warned each other to refuse her invitations to claim illness or pressing work that prevented them from attending the baptisms. But refusal was not truly an option. When Eleanor selected a man for baptism, the plantation overseer ensured his attendance. Those who resisted were threatened with the whip, with sale, with violence against their loved ones. The baptisms were presented as a privilege, an opportunity for spiritual elevation. To refuse was to invite suspicion and punishment. And so they went to the water. One by one they walked to their deaths, wearing the clothes of penitence, speaking words of acceptance they did not feel, submitting to a violation that was called holy. In the summer of 1849, Eleanor baptized a man named Elijah. He was 19 years old, newly arrived at the Ashford plantation after being sold south from Virginia. According to the ledger, Elijah had been separated from his mother and siblings in the sale. He could read and write, skills that marked him as potentially dangerous, as someone who might forge passes or communicate with abolitionists. Eleanor chose him specifically, she admitted, in her confession because of his youth and his sorrow. She saw in his eyes the kind of deep, inconsolable grief that she found most compelling. She told herself that he needed her salvation most desperately. The baptism took place on July the 23rd, as the sun set blood red over the swamp. Eleanor led Elijah into the water, speaking the familiar words of the ritual. But this time, something went wrong. Elijah fought back. He understood what I intended, Eleanor wrote. Perhaps someone had warned him, or perhaps he simply saw the truth in my eyes. When I moved to embrace him, when I placed my lips upon his, he turned his face away. When I tried to pull him deeper into the water, he resisted. He was young and strong, and I am not a large woman. He could have overpowered me. He could have held me beneath the water, could have drowned me as I had drowned so many others. But he did not. Even in his terror, even understanding what I meant to do, he would not raise his hand against me, because I was white, because I was the Reverend's wife, because a lifetime of conditioning, of brutality and fear had taught him that to resist was to ensure a death far worse than drowning. So he simply stood there in the water, trembling as I spoke my prayers, and when I pulled him under, he let me. He opened his mouth and took in the water. He stopped struggling after only a moment. I felt his life leave him, felt it enter me, and I knew that I had taken something different this time. Not just his sin, but his surrender. His terrible, helpless surrender. Elijah's death marked a turning point. Eleanor's confession becomes more fragmented after this entry, more incoherent. The handwriting deteriorates, the words sometimes illegible, as if written in a state of extreme agitation. She began to claim that the dead were speaking to her, that she could hear their voices in the sound of water, in the whisper of wind through the swamp grass. She wrote of seeing faces in the water, of feeling hands grasp at her ankles when she stood near the baptismal pool. She described dreams in which she was pulled beneath the surface by dozens of hands, held down as she had held them down, feeling her lungs burn as theirs had burned. "They are calling to me," she wrote, "the voices of the freed. They tell me that my work is not complete. There is still sin to be cleansed, still souls to be saved. They tell me that I must continue until the last sin is washed away, until the last debt is paid." She began to speak openly of her mission, no longer concealing her methods behind religious euphemism. She told her husband that the baptisms required the fullest commitment of body and spirit, that true cleansing could only be achieved through complete union and complete sacrifice. The Reverend Josiah, blind and perhaps willfully ignorant, did not understand. Or perhaps he did, and simply could not allow himself to acknowledge the truth. He praised her devotion. He encouraged her work. He called her a saint. In November of 1849, Eleanor baptized her final victim. It was her husband. The Reverend Josiah Whitmore died on November the 18th, 1849. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, a condition consistent with his long illness. But Eleanor's confession tells a different story. "I led him to the water on a cold morning," she wrote. "He could not see where we were going, could not see my face as I guided him into the pool. I told him that I wished to baptize him anew, to cleanse him of the sins he had accumulated through his long ministry in this place of suffering. He agreed, trusting me as he had always trusted me. I spoke the words of baptism, and then I confessed to him what I had done. I told him of the 23 men I had baptized and drowned. I told him of the sin I had absorbed into my body, of the pollution that now lived within me. I told him that he, too, was guilty, that his complicity in the institution of slavery had marked his soul as surely as it had marked mine. He began to weep. Even blind, even weak, he understood at last what his wife had become. He asked me why. He asked me how I could believe that murder was the path to salvation. I told him that they were not murders, they were transfigurations. I told him that every man I had baptized was freed from his earthly suffering, released into the arms of God with a soul washed clean by my sacrifice. I told him that I had taken their sins into myself so that they might enter paradise unburdened. He called me mad. He called me a devil. He tried to leave the water, but his legs were weak, and he stumbled. I caught him. I held him as I had held the others, and then I pushed him beneath the surface. He did not struggle long. The illness had weakened him too much. I held him under and felt his body go slack. I felt his final breath rise to the surface in bubbles that broke against my hands, and I felt the weight of his sin enter me, heavier than all the others combined, because his sin was the sin of ignorance, the sin of willful blindness, the sin of calling evil good and good evil. When I pulled his body from the water and laid it on the bank, I looked upon his face and felt nothing, no grief, no guilt, only a vast and terrible emptiness. Dr. Holt set the confession aside and covered her face with her hands. She sat in the silence of her office as night pressed against the windows. The document spread before her represented the most disturbing case of psychological depravity she had encountered in her career. Eleanor Whitmore had constructed a religious framework that allowed her to satisfy sadistic urges while believing herself to be an instrument of divine mercy. She had sexualized and weaponized the sacred ritual of baptism, turning it into an act of violation and murder, and she had done it all in the name of redemption. The final pages of Eleanor's confession described her last days at the plantation. After her husband's death, she remained in the chapel, refusing to leave, refusing to eat. The Ashford family, perhaps sensing scandal, made arrangements to have her quietly removed and committed to an asylum in Mobile. But Eleanor vanished before they could take her. On the night of December the 12th, 1849, 2 days before she completed her written confession, Eleanor Whitmore walked into the swamp. Several enslaved workers reported seeing her moving through the darkness, walking toward the baptismal pool. She wore a white dress, they said, and her hair hung loose down her back. She was singing a hymn, though the words were strange and the melody discordant. They watched from a distance as she waded into the water. They watched as she kept walking deeper and deeper until the water reached her waist, then her chest, then her neck, and then she simply disappeared beneath the surface. The water, they claimed, turned black where she had been standing, as if her body had released some dark pollution into the pool. No one went to retrieve her. No one wanted to touch the water where she had drowned herself. The pool was avoided after that night, the area around it considered cursed. When the plantation was eventually abandoned after the war, the swamp reclaimed it entirely. Eleanor's body was never recovered. Some claimed that the swamp simply absorbed her, that she had been taken by the spirits of those she had killed. Others insisted that she had not drowned at all, that she lived still in the depths of the swamp, sustained by the sins she had consumed. Dr. Holt completed her investigation in the spring of 1898. She published her findings in an academic journal, though the details were carefully sanitized to protect the sensibilities of her readers. The full confession was sealed in the University archives, accessible only to researchers with special permission. The chapel ruins were torn down completely, and the land was sold to a timber company that cleared the swamp and drained the baptismal pool. But the story did not end there. During the demolition of the chapel, one of the workers, a man named Thomas Reeves, drowned mysteriously in a nearby river. The circumstances of his death were never adequately explained. Reeves had been a strong swimmer, and the river was calm that day. His body was found in shallow water, his face turned upward as if he had been looking at something above him. His expression, witnesses said, was one of absolute terror. Dr. Holt, reading the report of Reeves's death in the local newspaper, felt a chill settle over her. She returned to the archives and retrieved Eleanor's confession one final time. She read through it carefully, looking for something she might have missed. In the margins of the final pages, written in letters so small they had escaped her notice before, Eleanor had added a postscript. The words were nearly illegible, scratched into the paper with what must have been a failing hand. The river does not forget. The water holds memory. Every sin I absorbed, every life I took, every violation I committed, in the name of redemption, all of it remains. I thought I could cleanse the stain, but I only spread it wider. I thought I could drown the sins of my fathers, but I only taught them to swim. The water calls to me now with voices I recognize. 23 voices and one more besides. They are waiting for me. They have been waiting all along. And when I join them in the depths, when my own breath leaves me and my own sin enters the water, perhaps then the cycle will be complete, or perhaps it will only just begin. Dr. Holt closed the confession and sealed it in its protective folder. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking. She had devoted her career to understanding the horrors of the past, to excavating the buried truths of the antebellum South. She had read testimonies of violence that turned her stomach, had traced the economics of human suffering through ledgers and letters. But Eleanor Whitmore's confession was something different entirely. This was not the banal evil of the slave economy, the systematic brutality of an institution built on dehumanization. This was something more personal, more intimate, more psychologically corrosive. Eleanor Whitmore had taken the language of salvation and twisted it into an instrument of torture. She had used the promise of spiritual freedom to lure men to their deaths. She had convinced herself that violation was holy, that murder was mercy, that her own sadistic compulsions were the stirrings of divine purpose. And the most disturbing revelation of all was that she had believed it, genuinely, completely believed it. There was no moment in the confession where Eleanor acknowledged her actions as evil. Even in her final entries, even as madness overtook her, she maintained that she had been fulfilling a sacred mission. She had been the vessel of redemption, the instrument of God's justice. The deaths were necessary. The violations were sacramental. The suffering she inflicted was nothing compared to the suffering she prevented by cleansing these souls before they faced divine judgment. This, Dr. Holt understood, was the true face of evil. Not the cartoonish malevolence of Gothic fiction, but the calm certainty of the righteous. Eleanor Whitmore had done monstrous things while believing herself to be good. She had perpetrated atrocity while convinced of her own holiness, and in doing so, she had created a legacy of trauma that echoed through generations. In the decades following Dr. Holt's investigation, the story of Eleanor Whitmore faded from public consciousness. The academic paper was archived and forgotten. The confession remained sealed. The land where the chapel had stood was logged and replanted again, until no trace remained of what had transpired there. But every few years, reports would surface. A drowning in a tributary of the Alabama River, a death ruled accidental despite puzzling circumstances, a worker clearing brush near the old Ashford plantation site who claimed to hear singing in the wind, a woman's voice carrying words that made no sense. A photograph taken near the swamp developed to reveal a figure in white standing at the water's edge, her face obscured by darkness. These reports were dismissed as coincidence, as urban legend, as the inevitable folklore that accumulates around places of historical tragedy. And perhaps that is all they were. Perhaps Eleanor Whitmore drowned herself in that pool in December of 1849 and left nothing behind but bones and paper. But Dr. Holt, in her final years, was not so certain. She kept the photograph of Eleanor Whitmore on her office wall, the one discovered among the papers at the chapel. The photograph showed Eleanor standing near the old slave quarters, her hands clasped as if in prayer, her face turned toward the camera with an expression that might have been serenity or might have been something else entirely. Dr. Holt would study that photograph in the late hours of the night, after the university had grown quiet and still. She would look into Eleanor's eyes, captured in faded sepia, and wonder what truly lay behind them. Was it madness? Was it evil? Was it some terrible combination of the two? A delusion so complete that it had rewritten reality itself? And sometimes in those dark hours, Dr. Holt would notice something about the photograph that she had not seen before. The image would seem to shift, to change ever so slightly. The expression on Eleanor's face would appear different, more knowing, more aware, and in the background, just visible at the edge of the frame, there seemed to be figures, shapes that might have been trees or might have been something else. People standing at the edge of the water, watching. 23 figures, and when Dr. Holt counted them, she always arrived at the same number, always 23. The nature of evil, Dr. Holt came to understand, is not that it announces itself as such. Evil does not arrive wearing horns and carrying a pitchfork. It arrives wrapped in the language of righteousness, justified by faith, sanctioned by belief. It looks like Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who knelt in prayer each night and rose each morning, convinced of her own virtue. A woman who murdered in the name of salvation and violated in the name of love. The Baptist tradition teaches that baptism is a symbol of death and rebirth, of the old self drowning so that the new self might emerge. Eleanor Whitmore had taken this symbol and made it literal. She had drowned the old selves of 23 men and her husband besides, believing that in their deaths they would be reborn into paradise. She had made herself the instrument of their transformation, the necessary vessel through which they must pass. But transformation requires consent. Rebirth requires willing participation. What Eleanor Whitmore performed in those dark waters was not salvation, it was annihilation. She had taken men who were already stripped of agency, already denied autonomy, already reduced to property, and she had violated the last thing they possessed, their right to their own bodies, their own choices, their own deaths. This was the true horror of her confession, not the murders themselves, terrible as they were, not even the sexual violation, though that added a layer of depravity that made the crimes almost unbearable to contemplate. The true horror was the absolute certainty with which Eleanor Whitmore had stolen the humanity of her victims, while believing she was saving their souls. She had given them no choice, and she had called it mercy. Dr. Mary Ann Holt died in 1923, having spent the latter part of her career studying the psychological mechanisms by which ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities. Her final book, published posthumously, was titled The Baptism of Sin, Religious Delusion and Moral Depravity in the Antebellum South. It never mentioned Eleanor Whitmore by name, but those who knew Dr. Holt's work understood that every page was haunted by the Reverend's wife and her final confession. The book posed a question that Dr. Holt could never adequately answer. What happens to the souls of those who believe they are doing good while perpetrating evil? Are they held accountable for their actions, or does sincere belief provide some measure of absolution? If Eleanor Whitmore genuinely believed she was saving those men, does that belief matter in the final accounting? Or is the road to damnation truly paved with good intentions? Dr. Holt had no answers. She could only document the horror, trace its contours, and leave the moral questions to philosophers and theologians. But in her personal journals, discovered after her death, she wrote one final reflection on the case that had consumed so much of her life. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that we would recognize it if we encountered it, that we would never be complicit in such horror. But Eleanor Whitmore was praised by her community. She was called a saint. The men and women around her saw only devotion, only piety, only a woman dedicated to the spiritual welfare of those deemed inferior. They could not see or would not see what she truly was. And I wonder, in our own time, what horrors we are failing to recognize because they come wrapped in the language of virtue. What violence are we sanctioning because it is called by another name? What suffering are we permitting because we have convinced ourselves it serves a greater good? The confession of Eleanor Whitmore remains sealed in the archives of the University of Alabama, accessible only through special request and with appropriate academic justification. Few researchers have read it in its entirety. Those who have uniformly report the same experience, a sense of profound unease that lingers long after the last page is turned, a feeling that something has been transferred from the paper to the reader, some stain that cannot be easily washed away. The photograph of Eleanor Whitmore, the one that hung in Dr. Holt's office for so many years, was donated to the university's historical collection after her death. It is stored now in a climate-controlled vault, protected from light and deterioration. But occasionally, when researchers request access to materials related to the antebellum period, they are shown the image, and occasionally they ask about the figures in the background, the 23 shapes that stand at the edge of the water, watching. The archivists explain that these are merely artifacts of the photographic process, tricks of light and shadow, the imperfections inherent in 19th century photography. And this is almost certainly true. Almost certainly. But there is one detail that no one has been able to adequately explain. When the photograph was first catalogued in 1897, the archivist noted that it appeared to show Eleanor Whitmore standing alone in a field, with trees visible in the background. When it was recatalogued in 1942 following damage from a flood that affected the archives, the cataloger noted the presence of indistinct figures behind the main subject. And when it was digitized in 2003, The technician remarked on the unusual clarity of the 23 people standing at the water's edge, their faces turned toward the camera, their expressions impossible to read. The photograph, it seems, has changed over time, or our ability to see what was always there has changed, or perhaps the image itself is somehow absorbing the accumulated weight of those who look upon it, revealing more of its truth the longer it exists in the world. This is the nature of historical horror. It does not remain safely in the past. It bleeds forward, contaminating the present, forcing each new generation to reckon with the sins of those who came before. Eleanor Whitmore's crimes were committed over a century and a half ago, but the psychological structures that enabled them, the dehumanization of the enslaved, the religious justification for atrocity, the ability of individuals to commit horror while believing themselves righteous, these structures did not die with her. They persist, they adapt, they find new languages, new justifications, new victims. The specifics change, but the underlying mechanism remains constant. Evil hides behind virtue. Cruelty calls itself mercy. Violence wears the mask of salvation. And so we return again and again to the confession of Eleanor Whitmore, not because we seek to understand her. She is perhaps beyond understanding, lost in the labyrinth of her own delusion, but because we seek to understand ourselves. We read her words looking for the moment where she might have turned back, the point at which she could have recognized what she was becoming and chosen differently. We search for that inflection point because we want to believe it exists, that there is always a moment of choice, a chance to refuse the descent into darkness. But Eleanor's confession offers no such comfort. There is no moment of doubt, no instant of moral clarity. From the first baptism to the last, she remained convinced of her righteousness, even as she walked into the swamp to drown herself. Even as the water closed over her head, she believed she was fulfilling her sacred purpose. The cycle would be complete. The sins would be cleansed. The debt would be paid. She was wrong, of course. The debt was not paid. The sins were not cleansed. The cycle was not complete. The water remembers. The earth remembers. History remembers. And in the swamps of Alabama, where the old Ashford plantation once stood, where Eleanor Whitmore led 23 men and one blind reverend to their deaths in the name of salvation, there are still nights when the water turns dark and restless, still nights when the wind through the cypress trees sounds almost like singing, still nights when those who venture too close to the water's edge report seeing a figure in white, standing in the shallows, her hands outstretched in invitation or warning. The locals know better than to approach. They know the stories, even if they do not know the full truth. They know that some places are marked, some ground is cursed, some waters should not be disturbed. They teach their children to stay away from the old swamp, to respect the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath the surface of that dark pool. But every few years, someone forgets, or someone new arrives who does not know the stories, or someone decides that old superstitions have no power in the modern world. And then there is another drowning, another accident that cannot quite be explained, another body pulled from the water with an expression of terror frozen on its face. The authorities investigate. They file reports. They rule the deaths accidental. And life continues because what else can be done? We cannot guard every stretch of water. We cannot memorialize every site of historical trauma. We cannot prevent people from walking into danger simply because others walked there before them and did not return. But perhaps we can remember. Perhaps we can acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is soaked with suffering, that the water we drink flows through channels carved by cruelty, that the air we breathe carries the echoes of voices silenced generations ago. Perhaps we can recognize that history is not a distant abstraction but a living presence, shaping our world in ways we rarely acknowledge. Eleanor Whitmore believed she could cleanse sin through violation and murder. She believed she could drown the guilt of her fathers by drowning those her fathers had enslaved. She believed she could achieve redemption through sacrifice, not her own sacrifice, but the sacrifice of those who had already been sacrificed 1,000 times over. She was wrong. Sin cannot be cleansed by creating more sin. Guilt cannot be absolved by inflicting more suffering. Redemption cannot be purchased with the bodies of the innocent. But her belief was absolute, and absolute belief, untempered by doubt, unchallenged by conscience, unrestrained by empathy, is perhaps the most dangerous force in human history. It allows ordinary people to commit extraordinary atrocities. It transforms personal pathology into sacred mission. It makes monsters while convincing them they are angels. This is the lesson of Eleanor Whitmore's confession, if it can be said to have a lesson. This is the warning inscribed in brittle pages, hidden behind a baptismal font for nearly half a century. This is the truth that Dr. Marianne Holt spent her life trying to articulate, and ultimately failed to fully capture. We are all capable of becoming Eleanor Whitmore, not because we are inherently evil, but because we are inherently human. We are capable of constructing elaborate justifications for our desires. We are capable of believing our own lies. We are capable of looking at horror and calling it holy. The only defense against this capacity is doubt. The only safeguard is humility. The only protection is the willingness to question our own certainty, to examine our own motives, to recognize that when we believe most fervently that we are doing good, we may in fact be doing the greatest harm. Eleanor Whitmore never doubted, and 23 men died by her hands, their final moments spent in the embrace of someone who believed she was saving them even as she drowned them. Their names are recorded in her ledger, each one followed by that single word, freed. But they were not freed, they were murdered, and the distinction matters, even if Eleanor could not see it, especially because Eleanor could not see it. The sun sets now over the land where the Ashford plantation once stood. The swamp has been drained and refilled a dozen times. The trees have been cut and regrown. The soil has been turned and planted with new crops. The physical landscape bears little resemblance to what existed in 1849. But the past is not so easily erased. It lingers in the groundwater, in the root systems of ancient trees, in the memories passed down through generations of families who remember when this was a place of suffering. It lingers in the archives, in brittle pages covered with cramped handwriting, in photographs that seem to reveal more each time they are examined. It lingers in the questions we cannot answer and the horror we cannot fully comprehend. It lingers in the recognition that Eleanor Whitmore was not an aberration, not a singular monster, but a product of her time and place and circumstances, a product of a society that built its wealth on the bodies of the enslaved, a product of a religion that justified that exploitation, a product of a psychology that could hold contradictory beliefs without cognitive dissonance, that enslaved people were both property to be used and souls to be saved. She took those contradictions and twisted them into something even more perverse. She made salvation contingent upon violation. She made redemption require death. She made herself the instrument of God's mercy by becoming the agent of ultimate cruelty, and she never wavered in her conviction that she was right. This is what haunts us about Eleanor Whitmore's confession, not the specific acts she committed, horrific as they were, not even the twisted theology she constructed to justify those acts. What haunts us is the recognition that she was absolutely sincere. She meant every word she wrote. She believed with her whole heart that she was fulfilling a divine purpose, and if she could be so wrong while being so certain, what does that say about the rest of us? What certainties do we hold that might be equally mistaken? What horrors do we perpetuate while believing ourselves to be virtuous? What violence do we sanction in the name of greater goods that exist only in our imaginations? These are the questions that Eleanor Whitmore's confession forces us to confront, and they are questions without easy answers, questions that should make us deeply uncomfortable, questions that challenge the very foundations of how we understand morality and meaning. Perhaps this is why the confession remains sealed, rarely read, seldom discussed. Perhaps we prefer not to look too closely at the abyss that Eleanor Whitmore represents. Perhaps we prefer to maintain our comfortable distance from such extreme depravity, to tell ourselves that we could never become what she became, that we would recognize evil if we saw it in the mirror. But the truth is more disturbing. The truth is that Eleanor Whitmore looked in the mirror and saw a saint. She looked at her hands, stained with the blood of 23 men and one blind Reverend, and saw them as instruments of divine grace. She looked back on her life's work and felt satisfied that she had fulfilled her calling. And that, ultimately, is the deepest horror of all. Not that evil exists, but that it can wear the face of good so convincingly that even the person committing atrocity cannot see the truth. Not that people can be cruel, but that they can be cruel while believing themselves to be kind. Not that suffering happens, but that it can be inflicted in the name of love and mercy and salvation. Eleanor Whitmore drowned 24 people, but before she drowned them, she convinced them, or tried to convince them, that their drowning was a gift, that their violation was holy, that their death was freedom. And in the dark water of that Alabama swamp, in the final moments before the light left their eyes, what did they believe? Did they accept her twisted gospel? Did they go to their deaths believing they were being saved? Or did they die knowing the truth that they were being murdered by someone who could not see murder for what it was? We will never know. Their voices were silenced. Their testimony was never recorded. They exist now only as names in a ledger, each followed by a single word that Eleanor Whitmore wrote in her careful hand. Freed. But the water remembers what Eleanor could not see. The earth holds what she refused to acknowledge. And somewhere in the darkness of that swamp, in the depths where light cannot reach, 23 men and one blind Reverend wait for a reckoning that has not yet come. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps some sins are too great to be fully accounted for, some horrors too deep to be adequately addressed. Perhaps all we can do is bear witness, record the truth as best we can understand it, and carry the weight of that knowledge forward into whatever future we are building. But we must remember this. Eleanor Whitmore thought she was washing away sin. Instead, she created a stain that will never be erased. She thought she was offering salvation. Instead, she delivered damnation. She thought she was doing God's work. Instead, she became the very thing she claimed to fight against. And the most terrifying part is that she never knew the difference. That is the final confession that Eleanor Whitmore could never make. The truth she took with her into the dark water on that December night in 1849. She could confess to the acts themselves, could describe in detail what she had done, but she could not confess to being wrong. She could not acknowledge that her entire theology was built on delusion, that her sacred mission was nothing more than pathology disguised as piety. She could not see herself as the monster she had become, and so she walked into the swamp, still believing in her own righteousness, still convinced of her divine purpose, still certain that her sins, if she had any, would be washed away by the same water that had received the bodies of her victims. The water accepted her, just as it had accepted all the others, and there, in that dark pool where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin, Eleanor Whitmore remains, not as a ghost, perhaps, not as a literal presence haunting the swampland of Alabama, but as a reminder, a warning, a testament to the dangers of absolute certainty and the horrors that can be perpetrated in the name of absolute good. Her confession still shocks historians, not because the acts described are so foreign to human experience, but because they are so terrifyingly familiar. The mechanisms of her madness, the structures of her delusion, the certainty of her righteousness, these are not unique to Eleanor Whitmore. They are patterns that repeat throughout history, taking different forms but following the same essential logic. We read her words and we shudder. But we should also recognize, we should see in her confession not just the story of one woman's descent into depravity, but a blueprint of how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil, how good intentions can pave the road to hell, how the language of salvation can become the instrument of destruction. This is why the confession matters. This is why it must be read, even as it disturbs us. This is why the story of Eleanor Whitmore, the Reverend's wife who drowned 24 people in the name of redemption, continues to echo through the decades. Because the water remembers, because the earth remembers, because history remembers, and because we must remember too if we are to have any hope of avoiding the same terrible mistakes, the same catastrophic certainties, the same absolute convictions that allowed Eleanor Whitmore to commit murder and call it mercy. The baptismal font is gone now, torn down and carted away. The chapel is demolished, its stones scattered. The swamp has been drained and filled and drained again. The physical evidence of Eleanor Whitmore's crimes has largely vanished, returned to the earth from which it came. But the confession remains. The words remain. The horror remains. And in the silence between the lines, in the spaces where Eleanor could not or would not speak the full truth, we can hear the voices of those she drowned, 23 men whose names we know, but whose stories we will never fully understand. One blind Reverend who died at the hands of the wife he trusted, all of them victims of a woman who believed she was saving their souls, even as she stole their lives. They call to us across the decades not for vengeance. Vengeance is beyond the reach of the dead, but for remembrance, for acknowledgement, for the simple recognition that what was done to them was wrong, regardless of how it was justified, regardless of what theological framework was constructed to excuse it. They call to us to remember that evil does not always announce itself, that horror can wear a human face, that cruelty can speak the language of love, that death can be delivered with a kiss and a prayer. They call to us to doubt our own certainties, to question our own righteousness, to recognize that when we are most convinced we are doing good, we may be at our most dangerous. This is the legacy of Eleanor Whitmore. This is the gift of her terrible confession. Not answers, but questions. Not comfort, but disquiet. Not closure, but an endless reckoning with the capacity for self-deception that exists in every human heart. The water is dark. The past is deep. And somewhere beneath the surface, Eleanor Whitmore whispers, still her twisted prayers, convinced even now that she was right, that she was holy, that she was doing God's work. And the 23 men she baptized, the 23 men she violated, the 23 men she drowned, they are silent now, their voices lost beneath the water, their stories erased except for single words in a ledger that no one reads anymore. Freed, she wrote, but they were never freed. They were stolen, they were violated, they were murdered. And the waters of baptism, which are meant to symbolize rebirth and renewal, became instead the instrument of their annihilation. This is the truth that Eleanor Whitmore's confession reveals, even as it tries desperately to conceal it. This is the horror that lies at the heart of her carefully constructed theology. This is the sin she committed, while believing herself to be washing sin away. She drowned them all, and her soul remained unclean, as it remains unclean still somewhere in the dark water, waiting for a redemption that will never come.